Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, Richard Peterson and Stephen Peterson, authors of The Slide, Leyland, Bonds, and the Star-Crossed Pittsburgh Pirates.
Our guests today are Richard Peterson and Stephen Peterson. They are the authors of this book, The Slide, Leyland, Bonds, and the Star-Crossed Pittsburgh Pirates. Richard Peterson, we'll start with you. What was the Pirates team you started following when you were younger?
This really dates me, but I saw my first Pirate game in 1948 at Old Forest Field, and they won, and Ralph Kiner hit 2 home runs. I thought Kiner would hit 2 home runs in every game, and that they would win every game, and didn't quite turn out that way, but I've been following the Pirates for a long, long time.
How was the team that year?
They were good, oddly enough. They were battling the Dodgers. The Dodgers had won the pennant in 1947. That was Jackie Robinson's rookie year. And they were battling the Dodgers all the way through the 1948 season. They finished in 4th place. Then they went into a nosedive and never really quite came out of it all through my childhood. so I've seen a great deal of losing Pirate baseball.
Who were your favorite Pirates as a kid?
Well, everybody worshipped Ralph Kiner. He was a star, and he was probably the only really outstanding ball player they had. The story was that nobody left the ballpark until Kiner had his last at bat. Even if they were losing 13-0, there was a possibility that Kiner was going to hit a home run. But I was small, and I was a little league pitcher, and there was this crafty pitcher named Murray Dixon, and I thought he was just terrific. And he won 20 games for them when they finished in next to the last place, and I thought that was wonderful. Then he lost 20 games the following season, so he was my favorite.
Stephen Peterson, when did you start following the Pirates?
Probably right around the time that this book picks up. Around 80, I think, was my first game. My dad took me to Three Rivers, and it was right, after they had won the World Series, that championship team with all those great players on it. And so I saw Stargell and I saw Parker, and all these guys from that championship team when I was probably about 8 years old. And I think I really fell in love with the experience of it, even more than the game, and because I just loved the scoreboard and the watching that. I remember it was actually a rain delay, and there was a lot of not actual game going on, and me and my 2 sisters who are a little older than me just loved that and loved just playing along with the games and the scoreboard. But I just loved the feel of the ballpark and the game. And then so then as I got older, I started getting into the game and getting to know more about these guys. And so when that started, the Pirates were great. They were terrific, because they just won the series, and that was also the time when the Steelers had won their 4 Super Bowl championships. So I just thought all Pittsburgh teams were amazing, and would be amazing every year, including the Pirates. And then things changed very quickly in 81 and 82, and then I wasn't sure what was going on exactly, but I stuck with them, and then when I really started getting into baseball, ironically, is when they were really, really bad. When this first kind of slide, around 84 and 85, and these guys, that's those teams. That's when I really started getting into it. And then my real heroes from were the 90, 91, 92 teams. This great team that we, is kind of the focus of the book with Bonds and Van Slyke and Bonilla. Those are my favorite players, particularly Van Slyke. I adored Van Slyke, and so.
Were you a fan continuously, or did your interest come and go as they?
I never wavered, amazingly enough. And I was not born in Pittsburgh. I actually never lived in Pittsburgh. My time here was every summer when we would come and visit grandmas and And that's, when I fell in love with the city. And also this stuff was ingrained in me, at birth when my dad was like, these are your teams, you have no choice. You know what I mean? There were no other teams. It wasn't even like debatable. Like if I was like, what about the Cubs? Because I was living in Illinois. I stuck with them, and I stuck with them, maybe it's because when I really started to get into them, they were already pretty bad, and then I was like, oh, what a surprise. Actually, when it became, in 1990, I was like, wow, they're good. Weird. And then I stuck with them through the 20-year of losing seasons. I don't know why.
Could you get their games on the radio when you lived away from Pittsburgh?
Yeah. I would get on the radio. You'd get them every once in a while. You'd get, when I was in Illinois, you'd get the Cubs games. So I'd get to see them play the Cubs. I lived in Milwaukee for a while, and so I'd get to see the Brewer games and see them come to town when they were with the Brewers. And I just followed them and stuck with them, and I just would see them when I could, basically. Yeah.
Peter, you the same as your son? You were with them all the way? Or
if you cut my wrist, I bleed black and gold. I'm just a diehard Pirates fan. And very much I sort of preceded Stephen in watching terrible Pirate teams. And so you had to love baseball to be a Pittsburgh Pirates fan during that period of time. And when I was an odd-hole kid in 1952, they lost 112 games, and the schedule was only 154 games. You really had to be a fan. We would go out to Forest Field, and they would put all the odd-hole kids in right field, and we'd be the only people at the ballpark. The foul ball would go in the stands, and we'd want to cry because we went over and get it, but we couldn't because they had us blocked into that one section.
Who were the players on that team that lost so many games?
Well, Kiner was still with that team, but I mentioned Murray Dixon. He was with that team. It was the era of bonus babies, and they had a bunch of kids because in those days, if you signed someone for over $10,000, you had to keep them for 2 years on the major league level. One of them, oddly enough, was Vic Janowitz, who won the Heisman Trophy at Ohio State University, because Branch Rickey was the general manager in those days for the Pirates. A good many people forget that. But he had this wonderful idea when he was with the Cardinals of setting up this farm system, and they went on to win all sorts of pennants and World Series. He had this wonderful idea with the Dodgers of integrating baseball, and that not only turned well in terms of racial issues in baseball, but also the Dodgers became the dominant team in the 1950s. For some reason or other, when Rickey came to Pittsburgh, he decided the best bet was the best athlete available. It sounds like NFL draft. And so he would sign people like Vic Janowitz, who was not a very good baseball player. And I can remember one time, he had trouble catching pop fly balls behind home plate. And fans would yell out, "Signal for a fair catch," as he circled under the ball. They had another catcher named Nick Kobach who batted 7 times in 2 years because he was so young and so terrible, but they had to keep him on the bench.
Did you listen to the games on the radio a lot?
Oh, absolutely. But in those days, that was the big thing, that you could walk down streets in Pittsburgh and you would go from block to block and you would not miss a play.
Who were the
because
announcers?
Everybody would have the radios on. Well, the great announcer in Pittsburgh, the Hall of Fame announcer, of course, is Bob Prince. And Prince was broadcasting games when I was growing up. But Prince sort of learned how to broadcast a game through Rosie Rosewell, it doesn't seem possible, but he was more colorful than Bob Prince. And Rosie Rosewell knew that a good many housewives back in those days were listening to Pirate baseball, and he would sort of gear his narrative to women as well as a male audience. And he came up with all sorts of gimmicks. The broadcasters didn't travel in those days. They were in the studio, and they were getting the games over ticker tape. And so he had time to set up an elaborate thing when Kiner would hit a home run. And instead of saying Ralph Kiner, hits a home run, he would say, "Get upstairs and raise the window, Aunt Minnie, here she comes." And Bob Prince would be in the background, and he would stomp her feet, and all of a sudden you hear this crash. And then Rosie Rowe would say, "She never made it, she never made it."
So how did you two decide to get together and write a book, and why pick a book about a lousy baseball team?
Well, it was actually my idea.
Yes.
To write something together. And he had been doing, we were both writers. I was a different kind of writer. I was, working in LA and screenwriting, and, had been doing that for a while. And my dad had been doing, authoring these, Pirates and Pittsburgh sports books for a while, and we were talking about what he was going to do next, and I think my mother was kind of
unhappy
with the idea of him doing another one. So then I brought up just one day, I said, well, what if we wrote one together? And then my mom was like, oh, God, no. And then, because now she knew she couldn't say no. And then, so it was like, well, what should we write about? And it was, of course, the Pirates, because that's, I think our greatest love of the Pittsburgh sports teams. And, he's a baseball writer before everything. And so we tossed around some ideas. And then I mentioned this team from the 91-92 playoff team, and how I thought that this, they don't get a lot of credit, and you read a lot of books about championship teams and great teams, and I just always thought that this was one of the great teams that never was, because they should have, they should have won multiple World Series. They should have been a dynasty with the talent on this team and how good they were. And it was sad because, of multiple reasons, mainly themselves, that never accomplished this feat, never actually even got to a World Series, that they just kept, getting to that point 3 years in a row and just kept, losing. And I just thought, what an interesting story about why, how all this talent and all this, and they got there and they got to that point, and how did this happen? This and to reach to this point, and then to get to this, there's this dramatic moment in the 92 NLCS, this slide, which is the initial slide, and building to that, and then how the story of how this really this moment just set off this, at the time you had no idea that this was, it was bad, but, it was really bad what was coming for the 20, and this was kind of the impetus for this other slide. So we just started talking about that idea, and what a great story that was, and how, it's not a story a lot of people know, and these great characters, and Van Slyke and Bonds and Leyland, and these guys, and how interesting it'd be to tell this story. And then it kind of evolved into more, than just that first slide and then the second slide, and then and how the city itself was was kind of in its own slide in the early 80s, before this even happened. So it really became about these 3 slides, and then we decided, that's
good idea.
a great idea. And so then that's how it happened. And then we had to figure out, well, we live on completely opposite sides of the country. How are we going to do this? And we did it. And we just kind of sent stuff back and forth to each other. And I'd read his chapter, he'd read my chapter, and we'd go
made some trips to Pittsburgh for research.
Yeah, did some research. We scheduled a trip 3 years ago. We were here, and they led us into the archives at PNC, and we were able to do some research and get some the great photos that in the middle of the book all came from the archives at PNC, and that's how it happened.
So the slide doesn't refer to the team going from being good to being bad, but what are the other slides that Stephen was talking about?
When we came up with the idea, we approached the University of Pittsburgh Press, and they said it was a great idea, but they wanted that slide within the context of Pittsburgh's civic history. And so we went back to the 1979 World Series. So Pittsburgh was on top of the baseball world. It was the World Series of Pop Stargell. They were going to win the World Series the following year, the first time in team history, 2 consecutive World Series. They were going to have over 2 million fans come out to Three Rivers Stadium. But then it started to fall apart. And so by 1985, the team was in complete disarray. So just 5 years after being on the top of the baseball world, the team was so bad that the Galbraiths, who had owned the team for a long time, decided they wanted out, and they wanted to sell the team. And there was nobody who stepped forward in Pittsburgh to buy the team, and it looked like the team was gone in 1985. And what made matters even worse is, on top of bad baseball and the animosity to the fans, you had the Pittsburgh cocaine trials in 1985, where you had current and former Pirates, including Dave Parker, going in front of a jury and talking about the use of drugs during that period. Drugs were a problem all the way through Major League Baseball, but because those trials occurred in Pittsburgh, suddenly it seemed to be a Pittsburgh problem. So it was a perfect storm in 1985, and you come to the first hero in the book, Mayor Richard Caligari, who brought together a group of businessmen, and he said, we can't let this happen. We can't let the Pirates leave Pittsburgh. He's a Pittsburgh kid. He grew up going around the milk routes with his father. He had worked in Parks and Recreation in Pittsburgh and became mayor of the city. So he brought in all these CEOs and heads of banks, and he said, we have to put together a group so that we can buy the Pirates. And he was so aggressive. My favorite Caligari story is that the mayor of Indianapolis, I think his name was Hudnut, he was going to send an emissary to Pittsburgh to take a look at the situation to see about moving the team to Indianapolis. And Richard Caligari said, if that emissary arrives at the Pittsburgh airport, gets in a rental car, as soon as he crosses the Pittsburgh city limits, he'll be arrested. Of course, he was bluffing, but that's how dead serious he was that they had to do something about this team. And of course, it scared the heck out of Hudnut because he had just stolen the Baltimore Colts from Baltimore, and so he just backed off. So they did it. They pulled it off, and they became an ownership group called the Pittsburgh Associates. And at that point, Pittsburgh sports writers were very skeptical about the whole situation because none of them had baseball experience. They were waiting to see who they'd hire as general manager. They hired somebody nobody had ever heard of, and he'd spent the last several years in real estate. And they said, here we go. This team is being run by amateurs. They overlooked the fact that this was Sid Thrift, who had extensive experience before he went into real estate with the development of young ball players. And then after Sid Thrift was selected, he had to pick a manager. And they said, okay, there's great managers out there. And they said, why not bring back Willie Stargell, make baseball history, first African-American manager. Sid Thrift selected a guy whose first name was Jim. And the outcry in Pittsburgh papers was Jim who? Nobody had ever heard of Jim Leyland. So there it was. You had Sid Thrift, who would become the architect, Jim Leyland, who would lead these teams to championship seasons, and there was a player who had been drafted. He was surly, difficult to get along with. Most major league teams stayed away from him, but the Pirates were so desperate they took him with their #1 draft pick, and he was waiting for his chance. He had his father who had more or less trained him to be a Hall of Fame player, and Sid Thrift took one look at him on a trip, and he brought Barry Bonds back with him. So,
did the ownership group have the money that they needed to put a team together to compete?
they put together a meager package. The Galbraiths were not very happy, but they said this is Bill Veeck, who had who probably owned more baseball teams than anybody in the history of baseball, said the only time an owner makes money is when he sells the team. The Galbraiths, it wasn't much of an offer. They managed to break even because the team had accumulated so much depth. But they were just glad to get out because the situation was so bad. There was a game where they asked Pittsburgh fans to show their support to keep the team in Pittsburgh, and they did. 35,000, 40,000 came out to Three Rivers. The Pirates were terrible. They lost to the Cubs something like 8-2, and the fans were cheering for the Cubs and booing the Pirates. And the Pirate players said, "Get us out of here. Put us in a different city. We can't take this anymore."
You always hear about Pittsburgh being a small market team. So could they compete? How did they do that?
Better than now, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And not as much, as in terms of them having much more money back then. It was just that you didn't have the ridiculous competition now. Yankees and Red Sox and those teams were still spending more money back then, but they weren't. It wasn't like now. What you have to compete with. With these major market teams.
Mm-hmm. You have one part where you talk about Barry Bonds wanted to get his contract extended. He wanted $3 million, right, which kind of sounds quaint.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely amazing. I think back then. The Pirates were very fortunate because they had Barry Bonds who was ready for the major leagues. So it took them a few years. They had Bobby Bonilla. They lost him and they reclaimed him. They made some trades, or they got through some disgruntled veterans and brought in a good many young pitchers. Sid Thrift, on April Fool's Day, traded the only decent player the Pirates seemed to have back in those days, and Stephen will remember Tony Pena, the catcher. He traded Pena to the St. Louis Cardinals for a couple players that no one had ever heard of. One was Andy Van Slyke. The other was Mike LaValliere, and there was a pitcher who became the Rookie of the Year, Mike Dunn. The Pittsburgh Pirates declared that the trade, because it was made on April Fool's Day, proved the Pirates had fools running the team, and of course we all know how that trade turned out.
But it's a little like they do now, where they just kind of, a lot of it's homegrown, and then they just get lucky. They find some bargains, or they get some guy like Bob Walk, who, back then, who seemed to be washed up or just kind of done, and then all of a sudden he finds a new home and kind of has a rebirth, and it's kind of the way the team is now too. So.
Well, tell me about Sid Thrift. How did he operate?
He was very aggressive, and he pretty much ran the show, and that led to a serious problem. Because everyone, you talk about Barry Bonds' arrogance. Well, Sid Thrift was certainly Barry Bonds' rival for sheer arrogance. He was the one who took responsibility for the improvement and for the Pirates' winning ways, and he just kept getting on the nerves more and more of the Pirates management, to the point that it reached a crisis, and they eventually fired him. And one of the things that disturbed him was that he kept taking credit, and he would give no credit to Jim Leyland during that period of time, where Leyland would take these pieces and he would put them together into this great team. So Sid Thrift was gone before the 1990 season, when they finally started winning divisions.
How was he treated by the media?
At first, again, it was like, why are they hiring somebody with experience in real estate? And they mocked him in their articles. I remember one sports writer said that if you can pull this off, there will be a city that will celebrate you for the miracle. He said it won't be Pittsburgh; it'll be Lourdes. It's that desperate of a situation. But again, they forgot that he had extensive experience, especially with the Pirates and player development. He could recognize talent, and he got the right players. But it bothered people more and more that Leyland was not getting the credit, because he was the one who had to put everything together. One of the controversial moves involved Van Slyke. When he got Van Slyke, because Barry Bonds was a center fielder, but he had a weak arm. Van Slyke was a better center fielder because he had a strong arm, and it was Leyland who moved Bonds to left field, which became part of this rivalry between Van Slyke and Bonds. They did not get along at all.
Was Jim Leyland the manager when you started following the team?
No. Well, I mean, that's right when the change happened. So probably like when I really started, following them and getting into them, that's probably right around when Leyland took over. But they weren't, they hadn't come out of their, the pieces, right when the pieces were coming into place for that team in the early 90s. That's when I started, really following them. So
what do you remember about Jim Leyland?
My main memory of him watching was him smoking in the dugout. Because even, it was a different time. It was the 80s, but, it still struck me as odd that this, the game was going on. This guy was having a smoke while, and, to calm his nerves, I guess. That was his way of dealing with things. But I remember him sitting in the dugout and smoking, and just him just being very good, and with being great with the players, I think, was the way I recognized back then. As you could see it coming together, and also not just his support of the players and his team, and he always was. That he was always very defensive of his team, but not putting up with crap from one person in particular. With Bonds, he really, he didn't baby Bonds, and he didn't, try not to let him get away with some of his attitude and his arrogance, and would try to put him in his place as much as possible.
How'd that work out?
Well,
should we talk about that incident too?
Yeah, well, they got into an altercation, and another thing I remember about Leyland is he definitely was not afraid to, like when I said he stuck out for players, it's like to argue calls and to get in the faces of umpires, which is what some of the, later managers didn't do. But there was an incident in spring training in '92, right? 91. Where Bonds was talking to the media, or they tried to talk to him, the media, and he said, "I won't talk to you," and wouldn't talk to. They were trying to take pictures of him, right? And he would only talk to. He would only allow his personal photographer to film him at this point, and this is '91, so he wasn't even, they hadn't won anything really yet, to have that, and so Leyland tore, saw it, walked over, tore into him in the middle of everybody at spring training, and let the F words fly, and
with cameras rolling.
With cameras rolling, so that was Leyland, right off, the bat. That was him, just the intensity and the fire in him, and especially if he saw something getting out of hand, either way, it was just his way of dealing with players, that made him great,
How was he with the fans, or did the fans like Bonds?
The initial reaction was negative because I really think the fans wanted Stargell. Though people like Joe Torre were also available at that time.
Oh, as managers.
As manager. And so when he was hired as manager, again, it was Jim Hu. They gave him a one-year contract for the next few years, one-year contracts. And finally, one of my favorite Jim Leland lines, he bought a home, and he said, contrary to belief, it's not on wheels, because everybody thought that he wasn't going to last very, very long. But he was just the perfect manager for this city, because he was, as Stephen explained, he was just a no-nonsense guy, great for a working-class town. He was great with players, but he had his limits. And that famous confrontation with Barry Bonds, which everybody can watch on YouTube, but keep the kids out of the room when you watch it. But he was just that kind of manager, and he became. It's hard to say he became the most beloved manager in Pittsburgh, but pretty darn close, because you have Danny Murtaugh back there. And it's interesting, when Leyland was hired, he said, "I'm no Danny Murtaugh," and he says, "I'm not easygoing. I'm not going to sit in a rocking chair. I'm going to pace in the dugout." And he did.
How were the fans with Barry Bonds?
Love-hate, I think. And I think that, me personally, that's the way it was, because I was a fan, and then I adored Bonds I still remember my Bonds shirt, my jersey that I had in '91. And then there were times where, kind of like that Leyland incident, where you just want to throw him out the window, where you're like, what are you doing? Where you could tell, it wasn't about the team, it was about him. It was those moments where he would drive you crazy. And I think a lot of fans just had that same reaction, where they, kind of like you said, where they wanted to love him. They wanted him to be the face of the team and the face of the Pirates, and because he was so talented, and he should have taken this team to multiple World Series, but he just had that thing about him. He had that arrogance, he had that selfishness, and that just got in the way of things. So it would just drive you crazy and grow to hate him. And I think now, I think most of the love is gone for most.
I want to read something in your book. You say the only difference between Bonds and Bonilla, in the commonly held view by those in the media who had to deal with him, was that if you called Bonds in the middle of a cold, wintry night and told him you were stranded with a flat tire, he would tell you to go to hell. If you called Bonilla, he would tell you he'd be right there and never show up.
The interesting thing about this story is that we interviewed every broadcaster for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and they had different stories to tell, wonderful stories to tell, but this is the one that's kept popping up, and they, each sort of claim credit for it. You talk to one and it'd say, "Let me tell you this story," and then you talk to another one and it'd be the same story about Bonds, but it really captures the view held of those two ball players, who are very good friends, by the way. Bonilla is one of the few supporters of Bonds on the team. That Bonds was just, he had that arrogance and that selfishness, that sense of entitlement.
And he didn't disguise it.
And,
But
and he just
Bonilla could hide it
He
better.
never hid it, where Bonilla would hide it.
Yeah.
And Bonilla would come off as this, well, I grew up in the Bronx, and every day is a good day for a kid who grew up in the Bronx when he's playing Major League Baseball. But a good many people, broadcasters, sports writers, sort of saw behind that and saw a different Bonilla who was never really content with playing the Pirates, and sooner or later was going to reach free agency, and where Bonds would head to San Francisco, where Willie Mays had played and his father had played. That Bobby Bonilla was headed back to New York with the Mets, and of course that's what brought things. That's why '91 and '92 become such terrible, tragic moments, because you knew that as soon as Bonds, Bonilla, even Drabek became free agents, they were gone.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Andy Van Slyke and Bonds didn't get along. Were there other players on the Pirates who Barry Bonds clashed with?
Everybody.
Everybody?
Just about.
Well, it's interesting. We interviewed a number of players, and they were very careful, very cautious. They pretty much would say, well, Barry made us a lot of money. So they really were reluctant to say negative things about him. That wasn't the case with sports writers, wasn't the case with broadcasters, and of course there's Jeff Pearlman, who wrote the book about Barry Bonds called Love Me, Hate Me. Jeff Pearlman, when he talked about Barry Bonds, never used his name. He had this expletive that he kept using over and over and over again, because Bonds was so hostile and made life so difficult for him when he was writing that book.
Did Barry Bonds ever talk to reporters?
Do you want to Paul Myers?
He did talk to Paul Meyer, and who actually was one of the kindest. You know, when we started this whole thing, and you know, we knew that Bonds was the character that was going to get the most attention and be the most interest in this story. You know, we said, well, you know, he's been painted so, you know, poorly by the media, and then you know, we said, let's try to put a positive spin on it. Let's really, you know, show Bonds, you know, that nobody saw, and then we kind of realized that maybe that just didn't exist. And so we go like, man, this is tough. And then Paul Meyer was one of the people who did. You know, have nice things, nice, you know, not awful things to say about him. That had a fairly, you know, good working relationship with him.
He was the beat writer at that time. For covered the Pirates for the Post-Gazette, and he would have fun with Barry Bonds. He said they used to have this duel with their middle fingers when he'd come into the clubhouse, and he just seemed to know how to handle Bonds in that situation. And they both lived out in the Coriopolis Moon area, so maybe that was a part of it, but. If you sort of categorize him, Paul Meyer seemed to know how to handle Bonds. Gene Collier really had nothing good to say about Barry Bonds at all. But Gene Collier really admired Bonilla as a ball player. And Bob Smizek had very little good to say about Barry Bonds as a human being, but he kept drawing attention to Bonds' talent, and he kept reminding Pittsburgh fans, this is one of the greatest players, perhaps the greatest player ever to wear a Pirates uniform, and you should come out and see him because he's not going to be here much longer. And he actually wrote on more than one occasion that Bonds was greater in a Pirates uniform than Clemente.
Did the fans ever warm up to him?
It was just hard to do. I think that's what it was. Like, even if you wanted to, I mean, you just had to look past so much, and you know, to embrace. He just wasn't this lovable guy, and it just never, you know, Steve Blass said the other day that it was not just that he was, you know, he had this arrogance, it was just unpredictable too, and you didn't know who you were getting sometimes, and you know, that he would soften up, you know, every once in a while, and he would be into it, and he'd be into the whole thing and with the team, and then, you know, the next day he'd be this guy, he'd be this Bonds, you know, who just you couldn't talk to, you couldn't deal with, who, you know, didn't care about you or anybody else on the team or the reporters, you know. So.
Did you try to talk to him for this book?
We did. All right. Yeah.
Well, in the case of Bonds, it's just, you know, send a word and it evaporates.
Yeah, I mean, we tried, but it I don't think it was happening.
Now, your book starts off talking about the 1989 World Series, and it has a point where they're in the National League Championship Series 3 years in a row and lose all three, but there was a big trough in between, and that's before the slide starts. So what caused the big trough in between and then the big drop-off after the championship
Well,
teams?
when they won the World Series in 1979, I think there was such a good spirit about that championship that people just thought it would go on forever. You know, you had it was the We Are Family team, and you had Willie Stargell, who should have been retired at that point, who had this remarkable season, tied for the MVP in the National League, was the hero of the playoffs, was the most valuable player in the World Series. He had to hit that home run in the 7th game of the World Series that won everything, and it was just that sense of it was back. That 1960 feeling was back. That 1971 season was back. It was Mazeroski in 60. It was Clemente in 71. Now Stargell in 79, and there's no reason to think that it couldn't go on forever. As Stephen mentioned, Sports Illustrated, for example, named co-winners of Sportsman of the Year Terry Bradshaw and Willie Stargell, and they were on the cover of the magazine. So it just looked great. But then what people didn't realize that there were old players on that team, including Willie Stargell. He wasn't that far away from retirement. And they suffered a number of injuries, and it just didn't work out. And it just snowballed. It just kept going downhill and kept going downhill until finally...
what was rock bottom?
Rock bottom, again, was that 1985 season where they lost 105 games at the same time that they had the Pittsburgh cocaine trials going on in the city. You had this beloved manager, another beloved manager with Chuck Tanner in 1979. His mother died during the World Series. They were down 3-1 in that World Series against the Orioles, and Tanner said he was going to stick with the team. And he said, "My mother died to get up to heaven to help you out, to help you win the World Series," which they did. He grew up in Newcastle. He was a fairly local boy, and they fired Tanner in 1985. His coaches were Willie Stargell and Grant Jackson. All of them had, Bob Skinner, all of them had played on championships teams. So it was just, again, the only way to describe it is a perfect storm. If it could go wrong, it was Murphy's Law in 1905. If it could go wrong, it would go wrong, and it did for the Pirates.
Now, we mentioned that the book is called The Slide, and you brought along a bobblehead thing of one of the slides that the book talks about. Can you talk about what's in this, what the slide was all about?
Well, this is the literal slide from Game 7 of the '92 National League Championship Series. And this is the moment when Sid Bream came chugging around third with his leg brace on, and the Pirates were winning. We're up by 2 runs in the 9th inning, and then this happened. And Bream comes chugging around, and you're just watching in disbelief. And this is, I can't believe this is happening. It looked like we were finally, this is it. We're going to the World Series. Here it comes, and then they tie it, and then here comes the winning run as Bream's limping around, and he slides into home, and LaValliere puts the tag on, and he's safe. And it was just, this was the moment. And the bizarre thing is, there's now a bobblehead of one of the worst moments of my entire life, which is bizarre. But this was a celebration bobblehead in Atlanta. In Atlanta, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened in baseball. And from the other side, not just Atlanta fans, but everybody looks at this is one of the greatest games in the history of baseball played. It's just this awful moment. It's for us and for Pirates fans. This was the moment. As soon as this happened, it's just like getting your heart ripped out. At that moment, because it's over. It's like, oh my God, wait, what? We were going to the World Series.
Was he really safe?
I think he was.
Mike LaValliere claims
Yeah.
he was out. We talked to Mike LaValliere, and he claims that when a player slides, he will raise the spike so it doesn't get caught. And he claims that Bream's foot went over home plate. Eventually, Bream did go over home plate, but by then, LaValliere had applied the tag. So Mike LaValliere, to this day, will tell you Sid Bream was out.
So there you go. So then, so now we have it for, and then Lavalier destroyed it, right?
Right. Well, it was the Braves wanted to do this for the 20th anniversary of the slide. This year is the 25th anniversary of the slide. So 5 years ago, they wanted to do the bobblehead. They couldn't do it without Mike Lavalier's permission. And you can imagine how difficult that was going to be. But Sid Bream, who knew Mike Lavalier quite well, contacted Mike Lavalier, and Mike Lavalier said, okay, do it. Sid Bream then sent Mike Lavalier one of the bobbleheads as a thank you. If people see the bobblehead, and there is a photo of it in the book, you can see why Mike Lavalier would not be happy beyond the fact that here is this play again. He's smiling as Bream scores the winning run. So 20 years later, he has this bobblehead, and the Pirates have lost every season for 20 years. And he's down at spring training, and he's helping out with the Pirates, and he walks to home plate, and he's carrying the bobblehead. He puts it on home plate, and he has something over his shoulder, which at first seems to be a bat, but turns out to be a sledgehammer. So he puts the bobblehead on home plate, he takes his sledgehammer, and he smashes it. So Mike Lavalier will tell you two things. One, Sid Bream was out. Two, that he ended the curse, the jinx, because they went on to have a winning season after he smashed the bobblehead.
So they started having their 20 years of losing from that moment of that slide
next year.
on.
Yeah, sure.
What caused it? Well, that was when Barry Bonds left. Did Bobby Bonilla leave?
Was
the
already
same
gone.
Already gone.
Yeah.
Already
You,
gone.
you see the loss of key players with each season. At the end of the 1990 season, they lose Sid Bream to free agency. Sid Bream did not want to leave Pittsburgh. He thought he was going to get a nice contract from the Pirates. Never happened. They lowballed him. He and his wife cried the night before they signed with the Atlanta Braves. It was heartbreaking. Leyland was upset. So Bream was playing for the Braves in 1991 when the Braves beat the Pirates in the playoffs, and of course he scored the winning run in 1992. In 91, they lost Bonilla again for the same reason. Bonilla wanted to sign for 5 years. The Pirates offered 4, and he said, I'm not going to do it, and he left at the end of the 1991 season. And so you had the loss of Bream, you had the loss of Bonilla, and then likely Bonds and Drabek were going to be gone after 1992.
So you knew this was it.
This was it.
That's why
this was it.
It would, so devastating.
Did the owners just not have the money to pay those kinds of salaries, or was it kind of a philosophy that tight-fisted?
Sure. Pirate fans may see a parallel with the Nutting ownership these days, but the Pirates could have signed Bob Bonilla by offering an extra year. They could have signed Barry Bonds. When Barry Bonds heard about the money being offered Bonilla, he said, offer it to me, I'll sign a multi-year contract. But there was a money issue going back to arbitration with Barry Bonds and Bobby Bonilla, and they kept losing in arbitration. And it became more and more bitter.
Barry Bonds lost in arbitration after he
Three
had a pretty good
years
season.
in a row. While Andy Van Slyke was signing very lucrative multi-year contracts, which rankled Bonds even more.
Was race an issue in this with the fans, with the owners, with the players?
Yeah. No, go ahead.
This is greatly ironic because in 1971, when the Pirates won the World Series, they made baseball history. They fielded the first all-black lineup in baseball history. In 1985, we go back to that horrible, horrible year. In 1985, Nightingale, who was the major writer for Sporting News, wrote an article in which he declared baseball dead in Pittsburgh. He said, We Are Family is a funeral dirge, and Three Rivers is a funeral parlor. And he, in that article, he said that one of the problems, one of the reasons that Pirates fans are not coming out to the ballpark is that there are too many blacks on the team. And he developed that theme within that article. So you have the irony of this team fielding the first all-black lineup in 1971, and in 1985, people are saying the team is too black for Pittsburgh.
So was that a factor? I don't know. No one directly said that, but I think that was kind of an unspoken thing, especially with Bonds and Bonilla and what the fans wanted to see, and who was of those three who was the most important to keep happy. Was Van Slyke. So no one said that. Was that taken by a lot of people? Was that the perception? I think so. So and that led to a lot of Bonilla and Bonds, I think and I don't think they were subtle about it, that was what was going on, at least in their eyes.
But when did the McClatchy group come along to buy the team?
This is another sort of unsung hero in Pittsburgh history. By 1995, the Pirates were in disarray again. They were in the midst of a tailspin. They were losing and getting worse and worse. Made a lot of bad decisions. And the Pittsburgh Associates, it just wasn't working out. The franchise was bleeding money. It was just going deeper and deeper into debt. And so they had to find an ownership. And this is where Mayor Murphy comes into play. He extracted a promise that the Pirates would give him time to find an owner to keep the team in Pittsburgh. So that's one good thing that he did. But he had developed this deal with, I believe the gentleman's name was Regas. And he was a cable czar in eastern Pennsylvania.
The owner of Adelphia Cable.
Exactly. And so Murphy thought the deal was locked up with Regas. He actually made a public announcement before the beginning of this was 1994, before the 1994 season. Major League Baseball said, wait a minute, we want to see the details of this deal. And it turned out there wasn't enough money flowing back and forth in the deal. And they asked Regas to put up more cash. He wouldn't do it. So Murphy had pretty much bet everything on Regas. And suddenly, there he was. He had no owner for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and time was running out. But he had this young, charming newspaper magnate from Sacramento named Kevin McClatchy. McClatchy had read in USA Today that the Pirates were for sale. So he came to Pittsburgh. Everybody thought he was a lightweight, didn't know much about baseball, didn't know much about finances. Murphy didn't really care for him, but that was all Murphy had at that point. And so McClatchy, to his credit, kept coming to Pittsburgh, kept trying to convince people that he could do this under great suspicion that he wanted to buy the team to take it back to Sacramento, that he wasn't a Pittsburgh guy. He just wanted to get his fingers on this team and take it out of Pittsburgh.
Why did he keep the team in Pittsburgh?
He fell in love with the city, and he fell in love with the fans, and he wanted to do this. That's what he kept telling them. He says, look at all the time I'm spending in Pittsburgh. Look at all the events I'm attending. Look at the money I'm putting in. And he ran around and he went to people like Frank Fuhrer and others, and they became, I think they're called managing partners. And then there were he convinced some of the Pittsburgh associates to stay in, and he did it on Valentine's Day, going into the 1995 season. He did it. And the immediate reaction, no honeymoon at all. They said, we're in the hands of an amateur again. There was, I think his name was Keaton, writing for the Post-Gazette, said he has so little business sense that you could take a thimble and put all his business sense in that thimble and still have room for your thumb. I mean, that's what McClatchy faced, and he did it. And he did something quite remarkable, because in order to buy the Pirates, Major League Baseball said 5 years. If you don't have a new ballpark in 5 years, you're finished. And he did it. So if you want to put into a simple formula for Pirate fans, no Kevin McClatchy, no PNC Park. No PNC Park, no Pittsburgh Pirates.
Did the Pirates ever get better under McClatchy?
No, not really. No, I mean, it's 20 years losing seasons, so no, I mean, not really.
Was he hands-on? I mean, did he get involved in player decisions, or did he just hire a GM and then step away?
He was hands-on, and he lost some of his managing partners because he was hands-on. But he just made a number of bad decisions. There were times when it looked like it was going to get turned around, where they would come fairly close. They went through a number of managers, a number of players. The players have promised, like Jason Kendall and Jason Bay, but it never quite clicked into place. But he was just a wonderful guy, and he was the one. Stargell was completely alienated from Pittsburgh after what happened. When he was third base coach, Chuck Tanner, when he was fired, took the managerial job with the Atlanta Braves. He took Stargell with him. And when Stargell came to Pittsburgh and he was a coach, they booed him. And Tanner said, "How can you do that?" after what he did for this city. And that was it for Stargell. He would have nothing to do with Pittsburgh. It was McClatchy. People said, what can I do to bring this team back, to put it in the good graces of Pittsburgh fans? And they said, talk to Willie Stargell. And he brought Willie Stargell back. He brought him back, put him in the organization, and he was the one responsible for organizing the committee that led to the erection of that statue that's outside PNC Park. Stargell died I think the day before the opening of PNC Park. And Kevin McClatchy wore a Stargell jersey and threw out the first pitch at PNC Park in honor of Stargell. I have the greatest admiration for Kevin McClatchy. I think there are people in Pittsburgh who don't, but I think he is really one of the most important figures in Pirate history.
He ended up getting forced out, though.
Oh, yes.
Why?
The Innings, the father, owned some shares, and he kept buying up shares. And eventually he ended up with more shares than Kevin McClatchy. And so he moved his son into management of the team. And so McClatchy lost a good deal of his power and authority because Nunning now controlled majority interest in the team, and he put his son, who is now the current owner, into a position where pretty much undermined whatever authority Kevin McClatchy had, and that was the end of McClatchy. He resigned.
During those 20 years of losing seasons every year, you stayed a fan?
I did.
And how many people did that in a city where the Steelers are kind of everything?
I think people, a lot of people did, but I know a lot of people defected. I know people who are Red Sox fans today, and I'm like, from Pittsburgh, and I'm like, why? And they're like, well, because of the slide, because they went on that dive, and then it was hard. Why do you stay? I think it's just loyalty, and it's just I think it could have been 50 losing seasons, and I wouldn't have stopped, because when it turns around, when it finally ended in 2013, the losing, it just makes it all that more sweet when it happens, and if you jump ship, and then it's never going to feel like it does if you stayed with that team, and they're going to turn it around. So
there was also a time in 2011 it almost ended.
It almost ended, the 11 season.
Was that another slide?
And 12.
Yeah, and 12. Yeah, they kept getting close. They had to do it. They had to end the slide in the most painful way possible, too, because they wouldn't have been them if they had just easily been had a winning season once Hurdle took over and but they came close, and in 11 it was kind of this freakish thing where they didn't even seem to have all the pieces of it, but then they started winning, and they were in first place in late July. I think early August they were still in first, and I think a lot of it is there a couple teams below them. The Brewers hadn't really hit their stride, and so it was a little bit of a mirage, the first one in the 2011 season, so then that one that one wasn't really real. It just it was bound to fall apart, and then those had their names. It was like the swoon, and what was it in 11? It was
the call,
the collapse. It was or the collapse, and then it was the swoon, or something in 2012. They kept having names because these things kept happening to this team, and then in 2012 they really started building, and these guys started maturing, and a lot of it was their pitching in 2011. I think started to kind of fall apart, and their they weren't capable of lasting this. And then 2012 they traded for Burnett, for AJ Burnett, and that
Martin,
and they got Russell Martin, and I think that's what that it really became a good team, and that was really kind of the sad one, because that should have been it. And again. And that's when they were the best team in baseball in early July. It's like, oh my God, this is it, and everybody started getting excited. And then August, hits, and like, oh, not, you gotta be kidding me. This isn't even mathematically possible. And of course they go into this swoon. I think 12 was the swoon or something. And then they just start losing and losing again, and they go in this ridiculous this losing streak, and then they're better, but they're still not at 500. And then 13, it finally, like, okay. And ironically, that 2013 season, they started off like 1-5 or something like that. And so everybody was like, oh, we missed it, and here we go. There's going to be 20 more losing seasons, and then like, oh my God, they started getting good, and here we go. It's working, and everything's coming together, and then they were so good that it was.
They made the playoffs.
They made the playoffs. They got in the wild card. Unfortunately, when they finally did get good and they finally became a winning team, you had to deal with the Cardinals, who were, would just kept winning the division. So they were still always chasing the Cardinals. They got in the wild card game, and it was amazing. I mean, if you stuck with that team, that wild card game in 2013, where the blackout game, where they, or the fans, or the place was, I wasn't there, unfortunately, but I watched it on TV, and it was just amazing to watch. And they said, it was funny because they said this city isn't going to know how to deal with this. When a lot of the sportscasters, like, are they going to know how you act at a play? We were some expansion team. Like, we don't know how to deal with we're not real fans. They don't know what it's like. And so, but then it happened against the Reds, this wild card team. We had the wild card game, and it was just it was on fire, and they were so loud. And Johnny Cueto for the Reds was the starting pitcher, and they just tortured him, the fans, to the point, where he's visibly rattled, and he drops his rosin bag, and then right after that, he gives up a home run to Russell Martin, and the place just explodes. So it was just like I said, if you made it through this, somehow survived this as a fan, and that was the best. Where was that bobblehead?
I should tell you that he would not let me touch that chapter. He wanted to write it. So he said, we collaborated on so many things. He said, not this chapter, this is mine. I've been waiting for this. So he wrote it.
So then they made it to the next level and played the Cardinals, and into the division series. And most I think baseball writers thought they were done after that. They would, the Cardinals would make quick work of them, and actually went 5 games. And they held their own, and they almost made it to the next level. But it was just an incredible season, and it was just nice payoff for Matt. Yeah. And then they won for a couple more years, and
Stephen, is this your first baseball book?
This is my first baseball book. Yeah.
Have you caught the bug, or did you get it out of your system on this?
No. I think maybe I have the bug. We've already been talking about.
Well, he's got to convince his mother to
the next one. Yeah. But now it's my wife too. We have to convince to let me do it. Also,
I keep giving him that classic Danny Glover line, and I'm too old for this. But he keeps coming up with these great topics.
Pete, how many books have you written?
Baseball books, let's see, 1, 2, 3, and I've edited the Pirates Readers. So I did a book about growing up in Pittsburgh in the 1950s called Growing Up with Clemente, and did a Stargell biography, and actually did one on baseball writing. And I've written a lot of things for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. They've been very kind, and they let me go back and write about the old days.
Well, when you come out with your next book, we'll have to have you back.
You're very kind.
We've been speaking with Richard Peterson and Stephen Peterson. They are the authors of this book, The Slide, Leyland, Bonds, and the Star-Crossed Pittsburgh Pirates. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.